What we don't get about China is that they are playing the long game and we're playing the short game.
Okay.
They're in it for the long term, and decisions that they make, we sometimes analyze and scrutinize through a shorter term prism, the quarterly returns, the annual results. They're in it for the long term. And while some of their decisions may be a little baffling in terms of where their economic policies might take them or where their military spending might lead them in terms of a geopolitical strategy, they're playing for the long term. And we rarely stop to think about what that means for the United States going forward. So imagine this, you sit at the negotiating table, as I have year after year, either as a trade negotiator or as a diplomat or in business, as many of you have in China. And on the Chinese side of the table, you have some of the best long-term strategic thinkers in the world. And on the American side, you have some of the best short-term tactical thinkers in the world. And there's a gap like this that today remains the challenge in the US-China relationship. How do you bridge that chasm between the way the Chinese see problem solving and their position in the world and how we see ours? So we've had the rise now, we're almost at the very end of the complete transitional cycle of the fifth generation coming to the forefront. They're all pretty much in their late 50s, early 60s, led by a man named Xi Jinping, who just turned 60 years old in June. He'll lead for 10 years. We don't quite get that part either. He's bringing up a group of, in most senses, like-minded decision makers. So if you look at the rungs of power in Chinese politics, it starts at the board of directors, as I would call it, the standing committee of the Politburo, in which you have 7 members, led by Xi Jinping. Now, China has 2 basic factions within the Communist Party. One, the elitist faction, and the other more of the populist faction. The elitist faction is tied into the princeling community, which are the sons and daughters, grandsons and granddaughters of the revolutionary elite. The populist faction is dominated primarily by those who grew up in the rural areas and came up through the Communist Youth League. Tuan Pai is what it's called in Chinese. You look at the Standing Committee of the Politburo, it's totally dominated by the elitists, with the exception of one, Li Keqiang, who's now the premier. So I suspect that Xi Jinping will be able to shoulder some major reforms through that we might not be anticipating. But below the Standing Committee of 7 people, the board of directors is the Politburo, where you have 25 members. And then below that, the Central Committee, where you have 375 members, half of whom are alternating members. And you start disaggregating who occupies those seats within particularly the Central Committee. And you come to a pretty a rapid conclusion, if you know anything about those who are there this generation and will be for the next 10 years, that there are some very able, capable, and smart people on the economic policymaking side, even some on the national security defense side. People like Zhou Xiaochuan, the head of the central bank and one of the most able central bankers I think I've ever met. Luo Jiwei, who until recently ran China Investment Corporation, now is the Minister of Finance. And people like Liu He, who is a graduate of Seton Hall, graduate of the Harvard Kennedy School, probably one of the more open-minded reform thinkers on the economic side. He stands now at the right hand of Xi Jinping through all of these decisions that are being contemplated. And here's now what's going to happen. And I hope that the eyes of the United States and the Western world are on it, because I fully suspect that the events that will play out over the next month or 2 may be some of the most important in the history of China and therefore the world since Deng Xiaoping launched the open door policies of 1977 and 78, shortly after the end of the Gang of Four, upon the death of Mao in 1976. We're going to hear now they've kicked what they call the 3rd plenum from October to November, which means they're still thinking through exactly what content to put forward. But this 3rd plenum event that we're all going to read about in November will represent a year's worth of work starting last November at the 18th Party Congress. So China has party congresses every 5 years, and they have since the death of Mao Zedong. They have people's congresses every year in spring, but the party congresses are when the leaders are brought to the forefront. So the 18th Party Congress in November, the new leadership, the fifth generation, took over. People's Congress in March, and now as we approach November, we're about to hear an articulation and a putting forward of what I think will be some far-reaching policies that will hit on fiscal reform, financial reforms, economic rebalancing, the movement away from an export sector to more of a consumption sector, and this broad, rather amorphous category called urbanization. So what do you do, as Wen Jiabao told us upon President Obama's first meeting to China, where I was with him as U.S. ambassador, his first meeting to China. Now, I also went with Ronald Reagan on his first trip to China, which was my first trip to China in the early 1980s when I was an advance man. And Wen Jiabao, then the premier, turned to President Obama right at the very top of the meeting after President Obama was going on about our economic challenges and so on and so forth. He said, how'd you like to have this as a challenge, Mr. President? How would you like to be a country of 800 million farmers, where today we only need 200 million farmers? He said, I'm left with 600 million redundant farmers, by the way. And yet look at why these megacities are being built and why they're so obsessed with job creation. Why? Well, if you have an itinerant workforce of 100 or 150 million strong, which is what you have today, it creates political instability, which is the end of the party if they can't manage it. So the warning lights start going off when unemployment gets above a certain level, when inflation spikes beyond a certain level, and when you have a roaming group of itinerant workers with nothing to do.
So I came to a view in Asia that you could model some of these countries by other institutions. So my view of North Korea is that it's essentially a military, right? It's run like the military, which means, and militaries are always in some form of conflict, which is roughly what's true of North Korea today. I came to the view of China that China is essentially a corporation, right? It's run like a corporation, it has net cash flow, net cash flow is positive, it has a series of strategic goals, it understands trading partners, and it's very clear as to what its mission is. What will cause, or what could cause, that corporate model of China that you're describing? You know, tenure board, tenure succession, you know, we're in charge and you're not kind of a structure. Is it this issue of a rural revolt that ultimately propelled Mao into place? Is it the environmental set of issues, which of course are terrible? Is it the internet?
Two things. All of those are absolutely trendsetters. But I would say that it starts with corruption. We're reading a lot about it, and you're going to read a whole lot more in the months ahead. And second would be economic inequality. Okay. So if you look at it from a Gini coefficient standpoint, you know, 0 being, you know, perfect equality and 1 being perfect inequality, and if you stop at 0.44 as being kind of the threshold where instability begins to occur, I would say that recent numbers have put China somewhere in the 0.60 to 6.2 category, which means you have a restive population that ain't gonna take corruption without putting up a fight. So what does Xi Jinping wake up to every morning? Every morning he wakes up to, first, what is the unemployment outlook? What do the leading indicators like inflation look like? What does the blogosphere have to say about me? And what can I do to send a signal to the masses about my ability to root out corruption? So you have the Bo Xilai case. You have
which they televised and put on the internet and live streamed everywhere, which actually took the Chinese internet down, which is amazing.
But it's interesting to note that the content of what they did broadcast, it was a totally scripted affair, was much different than what was broadcast. So my first view of China was 1979 when the Gang of Four was broadcast. Days and days of trials that many of you will remember if you're old enough, pretty much unscripted. This was fairly scripted. So the corruption side will have to be dealt with. We're not yet to where the full story has been told. Will you be able to root it out completely from society? Of course not. But can you cut off a few chicken heads to scare the monkeys, as they say in an old Chinese saying? Of course you can. And that's exactly what Xi Jinping will endeavor to do as he consolidates his power. So the goal for him will be by the end of this year, which is typical for any Chinese transition, you want to make sure that you fully consolidated power after a year in office among the People's Liberation Army, the largest standing army in the world, among the Communist Party of China, which is about 80 million members strong and 4,500 outposts around the country, still the central organizing group of the country. And three, you have to hit a home run with the so-called princeling population, which still populates a lot of the state-owned enterprises and a lot of the key positions of power in the individual ministries. The SOEs will have to be dealt with. So if you look at the economic return performance of the top 500 private companies in China and compare it to the return of, say, just 2 state-owned enterprises, Sinopec being one of them, doesn't come anywhere close. The state-owned enterprises are so dominant right now in China. One of the reasons being is that they've been able to write their rules for the last 10 years. I would argue that under Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao and the last 10 years of Chinese leadership, they've squandered their capital. They were unable to basically do the hard work to rein in the state-owned enterprises. They failed, and consequently the state-owned enterprises are even more powerful today than ever before. There's only one person who can begin to rein that in, and that is Xi Jinping. He knows what's ahead, he knows what must be done, and he knows what the cost of failure will be as well.
Good. I wanted to switch completely to talk a little bit about US politics, and in particular the Republican Party. You are truly an expert in the machinations of running for president and the various political factions.
Boy, look where it got me.
That's right.
Third in New Hampshire didn't quite cut it.
Can you describe the state of the Republican Party today? Obviously, President Obama won re-election in a relatively strong set of votes. What is the Republican Party going to do to try to win in 2016? There's some people who believe that the Senate will turn Republican, so you'll have a House Republican and basically have an all Republican Congress in 2014. I'm not sure, but that's some people have modeled it that way. Give us a little bit of a map of what's going to happen. Any political party has different disagreements over various things.
I'm totally over my head on this one, but let me give it a try. First of all, if you're going to win as a Republican, it's helpful for people to know what you're for and not what you're against. And I think the Republican Party has done a horrible job articulating what we're for. So you have all of these ads saturating the airwaves about defunding Obamacare. Well, what on earth does that mean? What are you going to do to replace it? Well, as governor, I had to do something about it. We had to get right to the heart and soul of those aspects driving healthcare costs at double-digit paces. We have not done a very good job putting on the table alternatives. And I think in large part, the messaging coming out of immigration reform, our failure to do anything about it, has frightened key demographics now for 2 election cycles. So if you look at the turnout results, if you lose the youth vote and women and Hispanic Latino voters, who I remember the election of 1984 when Reagan used to go around this country and all those signs, "Viva Reagan, Viva Reagan." He carried a large majority of the Hispanic Latino population. We lost probably 60-40. And then even deeper, you lose the Asian American population, 75-25. You have to work pretty hard to lose a group that naturally is inclined to want to support the Republican Party platform.
You have been identified with a group of people, and I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, that believe that there's a set of Republican values that are not being expressed, that goes something like this: small business, entrepreneurship, self-reliance, these sorts of American values. The current Republican Party doesn't seem to be leading with those, except maybe in a little bit of advertising, but their actions are inconsistent with some of that. If you look at a bias towards large businesses, et cetera. Is there a way, can you characterize that as a different movement within the Republican Party that you see, or is that just normal criticism of the political process?
Well, the Republican Party doesn't exist today in the sense that there is an organized Republican Party. You have factions of the Republican Party, and until such time as there's something that begins to coalesce the various factions, there won't be a Republican Party. I mean, you can imagine another loss in 2016, and again, we're 25% of the way to 2016. Then presumably the Republican Party is out until, what, 2024? How do you maintain any viability as an alternative governing party during a length of years where the lights have been completely out and you haven't been seen as governing? And the last time you governed, we had wars and we had economic failure. I don't know what happens at that point, but probably the rise of alternative political movements, maybe even third-party movements of some kind. But the Republican Party to survive is going to have to speak to the goals and aspirations of the people in this country, in the sense that it rebuilds the opportunity ladder for all people. Right. That the rules of the game are made the same, that the marketplace is fair, and that people can see a way out of their current circumstances. That's what the party has always been about. Yet today we're caught up in a lot of fringy issues right now that just don't make a whole lot of sense.
What's interesting is you've put to some degree your money where your mouth is. You're working on this no labels campaign with some Democratic I think, friends on this issue. Can you sort of describe what might happen as a result of that work? In other words, presumably you're trying to fix this.
Here's the big thing that I think we'll see in politics in the years ahead, because we can't keep doing what we're doing today. It's not yielding any progress, any results, any problem solving, anything that represents progress for the people. The next big thing in politics, I do believe, and this is right within the Republican wheelhouse when you look back at Teddy Roosevelt. I mean, you look at the election, for example, of 1912, although Roosevelt didn't win, he kind of ran as an alternative third-party move. It was about reform. I think the road forward for Republicans, quite frankly, is embracing reform. You've got to fix a broken system, and there's no party better situated than the Republican Party to talk about what needs to be reformed. Now, what are some of those elements? You're going to have to talk, something the Republican Party doesn't, I think, talk very naturally about, and that's about campaign finance reform. Nobody wants to mention it, but the system we have today is an abomination. It's an embarrassment. When you can get a casino owner who could put $50 million behind one person, we call that good for the people. I mean, who are we fooling? Number two, we now have created a situation where 70% of the House of Representative seats in this country are predictably red or blue, Republican or Democrat, MSNBC, Fox News. And all these people in the middle say, what about us? Who's representing our interests? And we've created this pattern throughout this country through redistricting. I tried as governor to get an independent redistricting commission in our state. I know how hard this is, and the legislature wouldn't have anything to do with it. And so it's used for politics, but this is what we've done to ourselves. I mean, just take a look at the landscape. Reversing that is going to take some real doing. Number three, I think term limits are about right for this country. I look at the folks who have served forever in the Senate. One of them from my home state who just won re-election. He was elected initially the year I got my driver's license. And I think he ran on a platform of change. And yet these folks, they run to the right to capture they sell all of their principles so they can get reelected, and they come back as if nothing happened, as if we're supposed to believe them going forward. I think term limits would be a really good thing for this country on Capitol Hill. There's some elements of reform that need to be discussed in this country that need to be driven by the will of the people. They want to speak out about it, and part of this no labels movement that I am co-chairing is ultimately to get to the point where we can have these conversations. So right now we have created what I would call a new governing coalition. At the beginning of the year when we talked about it, people made fun of it. You know, the stories in the newspapers sort of cut it to shreds. How is this no labels? Who are these people? Are they a bunch of mushy moderates? Is it a third-party movement? No. Our purpose is to bring Republicans and Democrats together in one room and to talk about not that which divides them, but that which brings them together, where they have overlapping and common interests. We started with 0 in our Problem Solvers caucus at the beginning of the year. Today, we are knocking on 100 members. Republicans and Democrats in equal numbers, Tea Party members like Dean Heller from Nevada on one end, Angus King from Maine on the other, a progressive senator. And people are now meeting every other week. It's the only thing on Capitol Hill that's yielding anything right now. And we have 17 bills to prove the concept, Eric, 17 bills that are headed to the floor.
That would be more bills than have been passed this year.
This is incredible. Now, admittedly, what they're working on now, and you'll hear more about it in the next month or two, is low-hanging fruit. They're all working on government efficiencies. How do you purchase better? How do you manage energy efficiencies a little better? Stuff that is just kind of a no-brainer for anybody in politics. But now we're going to be moving toward how you handle the debt ceiling, for example, without having a complete cataclysmic disaster again for the private sector. All they want is some sense that the marketplace is going to be consistent and predictable going forward. And our political class can't seem to deliver that.
So my final question, are you going to run again?
I might look crazy, but I'm not insane.
That's a yes, you're going to run again?
No, I'm a big believer. We've given the best years of our lives to politics, and I've had the most unbelievable career in public service. You win some, you lose some, but serving 3 times as an ambassador for my country, being elected governor twice, running for the presidency, which was an incredible journey.
15, 20 years in public service.
Half of our professional career, at least, the other half in private life. And I believe that there is a season for all things, as the saying goes. And I think our season now is probably to reconnect with private life, to recharge and see where things go. But we need to encourage, I guess my last comment to all of you here, the one thing that really strikes you as you're standing on the debate stage, which I did over and over again in things that became something more akin to game shows than a presidential debate. And you look at the 5 or 6 or 7 people standing on the stage. You look at all the folks in the audience, you look at all the networks in the back of the room broadcasting this stuff to 10 million viewers. And you think for a country of 320 million people, some of the most innovative, creative, courageous folks in the world, this is the best we can do? This is it? And it struck me throughout that we're not able to get folks into the arena who are willing to take the risk from private life, take the risk, do what's right for their country, and leave the world a better place. And I hate the thought that we might end up in a siloed country, the politicians and the business class.
I have a feeling that Governor Huntsman's role in politics is not over. So thank you very much.